In 1832, a Jewish family fled persecution, seeking sanctuary. Among all possible destinations worldwide, they chose India as their refuge. Within mere years, people began calling these refugees the Rothschilds of the East. The family I'm discussing gained considerable recognition through their generous donations, constructing schools, hospitals, and numerous other institutions. However, beneath this charitable facade, the true origin of their wealth came from devastating millions of lives. Unsurprisingly, the British Empire was their greatest patron. Prepare yourself, because today we're exploring the Sassoon family story and their sinister empire. The story of the Sassoon dynasty began in the late 1820s with David Sassoon. He was the family's founding father who had to flee Baghdad for his life. He was a son of Sheikh Sassoon ben Salih. Ben Salih served as a long-time chief treasurer in Baghdad's government. Now that position made the family influential, but it also put them at risk. When the notoriously greedy city's governor turned hostile, David was threatened and even held hostage. Fearing for his safety, David first escaped to Iran with his young family. The move offered them temporary refuge, but he soon sought greater stability and better business opportunities. And British India promised both of those things. But there was a far darker side to this. The British administration welcomed Jewish minorities to work in the growing trade sector because there was no risk of them rebelling should they grow too wealthy. The number of Jewish people was so insignificant that the British never felt threatened, so they invited them. There are even some claims that a British political agent may have encouraged the Sassoons to settle in British India instead. Now, David's decision to move could not have come at a better time. That's because Bombay was slowly emerging as the commercial jewel of Western India. Cotton and opium formed the backbone of its prosperity, and the British were expanding the city's role as a global trading hub. Now David did not arrive empty-handed. He brought with him his father's carefully cultivated network of merchant contacts stretching across the Middle East. These ties gave him unique access to markets, capital, and trust at a time when these kinds of networks determined whether a venture would fail or thrive. Now, it's important to note that this family wasn't your average merchants back in Baghdad, because they knew court politics. From the moment he arrived, David aligned himself with British imperial interests. His loyalty won him trust and protection under colonial rule at a time when most Indian subjects were viewed with suspicion. David knew that there was profit to be made within the constraints of that empire. That's why he kept tabs on British conquests and wars. He also spread his investments, building businesses in the new markets that were created by British imperial expansion. His family's biggest windfall, though, came with the opening of China's massive domestic market. As you know, the demand for opium in China was immense. But let me give you a quick recap on why this was the case. The history is that the British wanted Chinese tea, silk, and porcelain, and China didn't have any interests in British goods, so there were no barter trade agreements. For the tea and silk that they sold to Britain, the Chinese demanded payment in silver. That's why the British were hemorrhaging their silver reserves. Soon, it became quite economically unsustainable for them. The Chinese Empire, in the meantime, was accumulating all this silver, but they weren't buying anything back from Britain, so there was a huge deficit from the British perspective. Now, to fix this problem, Britain flooded China with opium that was being grown in India. This was done with the intention of reversing that deficit. As you know, opium is a highly addictive and destructive drug, a product for which Chinese consumers would pay in silver. And that's how the British balanced their trade deficits and extended their influence into Asia. And the Sassoons, well, they took advantage of this and soon became the dominant exporter of opium. The scale was vast. In 1836 alone, the company shipped over 30,000 chests of opium to China. Each of these chests would weigh around 120 pounds. So just imagine the scale of this. This kind of flooding of narcotics created widespread addiction in China's coastal cities. As a result, millions of people in China suffered, becoming addicts to one of the worst substances ever created. But the Sassoons, on the other hand, were becoming immensely rich, and with that money came influence. David Sassoon became a household name in Bombay. His family's philanthropy gave them great prestige. Ordinary Indians didn't think too much about how the family was making money because all they could see with their own eyes were only the good things: the new schools, the docks, the libraries, the hospitals being built. I mean, this earned the family great respect and admiration. And after younger Sassoons carried this legacy even further, they received honors directly from the Viceroy, the highest-ranking British official in India. Let me give you an example of how influential they were and how much people respected them. They created a system where Bombay's tramways issued special Sabbath passes so that Jewish passengers could avoid handling money on Saturdays in line with their religious observance. That's how much influence they had. Now, the Sassoon family's fame and influence wasn't limited to just India. Given their strong ties with the British administration and their vast wealth, they managed to secure privilege in Britain itself. David Sassoon set the precedent. In 1853, he was granted British citizenship in recognition of his services to the empire. I mean, few colonial subjects achieved such a status, and it marked the family's entry into the inner circles of the British Empire. Now, later generations would go even further when it came to their status in British society. They used their opium fortunes to purchase stately homes across England. These estates allowed them to move in elite circles and to cultivate ties with the royal family. Now, remember how I said that many people refer to the Sassoons as the Rothschilds of the East? Well, it turns out that the Sassoon family started mingling with the actual Rothschilds. The interests of the Sassoon family were uniquely intertwined with those of the empire. For instance, in 1859, their stately Bombay home hosted a gathering of 500 guests. And this was really messed up, because it was actually a huge celebration of Britain's decision to impose even more direct control over India, and they were hosting the gathering where they were celebrating this. So events like this demonstrated how firmly the Sassoons had tied their fortunes to imperial British power and backing Britain itself. The Sassoons were being recognized as peers by the ruling class. A clear example of this is David's son, Reuben Sassoon. He soon became a close companion of the Prince of Wales and future King Edward VII. Now, you have to appreciate how much of a big deal this was because the status and access to the heir of the throne was extraordinary for a family who were just refugees in India just a few generations ago. Their prestige was also enhanced by their strategic marriage with the Rothschilds. Albert Sassoon's son married a Rothschild daughter, cementing the ties between the two Jewish dynasties, who were both integral to British imperial endeavors. Essentially, the Rothschilds financed war and conquest, while the Sassoons supplied opium to offset Britain's crippling trade deficit with countries like China. Now, this constant attempt by the Sassoons to be British also led to somewhat of an identity crisis. Many of the descendants of the family were actually embarrassed by the reminders of their origins. They had relatives from India visiting them, and the Sassoons felt deeply uncomfortable and ashamed by this. Despite their fortunes and titles, the Sassoons could never fully escape the tension between their Eastern roots and their Western aspirations. How could they? Their entire success was tied to India and the opium trade, and their fortune was about to reach new heights very soon. Britain's victory in the Opium Wars against China made it easier for Indian opium to be exported. A quick refresher on the Opium Wars. Essentially, there were two conflicts in the mid-19th century between China and Great Britain. They fought over trade access and the legalization of opium. In the aftermath of all this, the Sassoon Company's trade soared to almost 59,000 chests of opium. The Chinese market was now wide open for a flood of narcotics. And naturally, the wealth generated from this trade propelled the Sassoons to even higher circles of influence. Albert Sassoon took over the running of the family business after David's death and carried the family's businesses forward. In 1873, he received the honorary freedom of the city in London. This made him the first Jewish person ever to be awarded this distinction. Not even a Rothschild had received this kind of recognition by that time. It symbolized just how important the Sassoon name had become amongst Britain's elites. Eventually, their reputation solidified even outside their drug empire. They were savvy enough to invest that money in legitimate businesses. Starting with David, the family had invested in property, insurance, and banking. These moves allowed the Sassoon family to survive the downturn in the cotton market and even the financial crisis that shook India in the mid-19th century. Now, new ventures followed as well. The Sassoons put money into an American railway syndicate, into Hungary's national debt, and even real estate ventures across Europe. The family essentially had a diversified global enterprise. But all of this was just a respectable front for their core business, which was drugs. Essentially, the family's fortune was still tied to the Indian opium trade into East Asia, which continued well into the 1920s. This was long after Britain and China had formally agreed to end this trade. The Sassoons also adapted to the times. They embraced new technology such as the telegraph, which let them manage their transactions across continents. They vertically integrated their empire as well by buying steamships to transport their opium, by creating maritime insurance firms to protect those vessels, and taking seats on the boards of banks that financed those trades. They were present everywhere from start to finish of their entire business model. Even as moral outrage against opium grew in Europe and India, the Sassoons didn't really care that much because they were making massive profits. Abdullah, or Albert Sassoon, mentioned earlier, even commissioned a family crest that proudly featured a poppy flower. And that's where opium comes from. Essentially for them, all of this was just business, one that they were very proud of. Abdullah or Albert Sassoon might have thought that the family empire would last forever. However, the next generation after him began to quarrel amongst themselves over money, and disputes grew so fierce that the family business split into two. On one side stood David Sassoon and Company, the original firm that built the family's wealth, and on the other side emerged E.D. Sassoon and Company. This was a breakaway venture led by another branch of the family. Despite having blood and family ties, these two businesses became bitter rivals. And that rivalry turned especially bitter because both firms competed in the same trade that had secured the Sassoon family's fortune, and that was opium. Rather than uniting their resources, the two companies tried to undercut each other, eroding the dominance that the family once enjoyed. And the generation after this would run into another problem: which is somewhat ironic: a lack of interest. The London branch of the Sassoon family inherited control of David Sassoon and Company, but they lacked the will to run it. For them, the firm was less of a business and more a fountain of wealth. Most family members preferred to extract capital to fund their lavish lifestyles, as opposed to actually doing the hard work of commerce. This kind of detachment soon turned into disdain. Some of the descendants came to despise the very source of their fortune. One of the family members mocked their wealth as money made, and I quote, "in the East by dirty trading." For a dynasty that once took pride in its poppy crest, such remarks showed how far the family had drifted from its origins. By 1939, the Sassoon family's direct involvement in David Sassoon and Company ended altogether. The firm lingered on under different management, but lost its former stature. By the 1980s, it had declined so far that the British government declared two of its former partners, and I quote, "totally unfit to serve as directors." Now, in the meantime, the other venture that I mentioned earlier, E.D. Sassoon, went on a completely different path, and that was being led by Victor Sassoon. Now, Victor tried to save the company. He made the bold choice to relocate to Shanghai, which was China's bustling commercial capital. To fund this move, Victor started selling off the company's Indian mills and assets, often at pretty depressed prices. Victor feared the rise of the Indian National Congress and predicted instability if it ever came to power. So in Shanghai, his gamble seemed to pay off, at least at the beginning. By the mid-1930s, Fortune magazine hailed him as Shanghai's #1 real estate magnate. His properties were estimated to be worth the equivalent of $1.2 to $1.5 billion today. And this relocation also had a number of unexpected humanitarian impacts. By 1939, Shanghai became one of the very few places where Jewish people fleeing Nazi persecution could enter without a visa. More than 20,000 refugees arrived, many of them with nothing, and they were welcomed with open arms by the well-established Baghdadi Jewish community, of which Victor Sassoon was the most prominent member. Now, this all sounds really positive, but these would be the final glory years of their business. You see, China soon brought sweeping nationalization moves. The Sassoon Empire in Shanghai was seized with assets worth over $1 billion in today's money. Victor's bold relocation therefore proved to be his greatest mistake. The fall of Shanghai marked the end of the Sassoon business as a global force. Officially, their empire was over. Unofficially, some still claimed that the Sassoons never really disappeared. Rather, they simply grew better at keeping their fortunes hidden. Money hides all sin, and nowhere is this more visible than in the story of the Sassoon family. A family that began as exiles from Baghdad became the Rothschilds of the East. They took advantage in the aftermath of British imperialist wars and built empires from narcotics that destroyed millions of lives. I mean, sure, they had a lot of prestige and they were very active in philanthropy. But in the end, it was their own decisions and breakdowns from within the family structure that ended their empire and left them fading into obscurity. Some say that this is exactly what they probably wanted, because fortunes like theirs rarely disappear. Instead, they dissolve, reappear, and resurface under various names, continuing to shape the world from the shadows, their legacy hidden, but never truly gone.